Hello, I'm Stephen DiOrio, the Executive Director of the Revenue Enablement Institute. Today, I'm joined by a panel of sales and marketing executives and operation leaders to discuss revenue operations, which has emerged as a board-level issue in the majority of the B2B organizations that we work with, both large and small. Revenue ops has emerged as a big issue for a simple reason. It directly impacts the board's ability to grow and protect firm value. This is because organic growth and the commercial assets that create it have become essential to value creation in every business. Whether you're a hyper-growth business, a Fortune 1000 enterprise, or you're attempting business transformation to a cloud-based recurring revenue model. The reason revenue ops is such a big issue is that it's very difficult to drive scalable and consistent growth. This is fundamentally because most managers are still trying to use organizational systems developed in the 20th century to manage a far more advanced and digital commercial model in the 21st century. Modern selling requires levels of speed, accountability, visibility, and teamwork that are unmanageable in a traditional stovepipe organizational model that most organizations are using today. A new management system is needed, one that does a better job of generating returns from commercial selling teams, processes, systems, and operations. This management system is most commonly described as a revenue operations model. The problem is, while there is general agreement that RevOps is important, there's very little clarity on how to define it and describe it because it's a relatively nascent and undefined discipline. To better define the revenue operations model, this faculty of the Revenue Enablement Institute engaged hundreds of business leaders, as well as leading academics and experts in the field. Based on our in-depth interviews with over 100 CEOs and CXOs and thousands of sales managers, performance professionals, and reps, our faculty, including the executives on this panel, felt revenue operations is best described as a management model that better aligns sales, marketing, and customer success, and the assets, systems, and processes that support them against a coherent set of customer goals. That's a mouthful. We've developed a 115-page report that rigorously breaks down that definition into specific operational components. Our research shows that senior growth leaders are making significant changes in their commercial leadership, operations, and architecture to unlock more growth from their existing commercial teams, systems, and operations. For example, over 90% of growth leaders, we call these CXOs, that we interviewed, are redefining their commercial architecture, consolidating the operations that support selling, and reconfiguring the roles on the revenue teams to accelerate organic growth as a top priority. 85% of CXOs are actively adding development reps, call them SDRs, BDRs, MDRs, ADRs, at the front of the specialists to add value in the middle of the funnel, and customer success managers at the end to manage retention, usage, upsell, and success. To lead revenue operations, over 9,000 organizations, both large and small, have introduced expanded CXO titles. Titles like Chief Growth Officer, Chief Commercial Officer, Chief Customer Officer, and Chief Revenue Officer. These titles have a broader scope and remit to better manage commercial assets, the operations and enablement infrastructure, as well as the journey. Over 90% of the CXOs we spoke to believe that commercial transformation requires leadership from the board and the CXO to succeed. So let's get started with our panel. I've asked some of the operations executives on our faculty to share their experience that they have gained transforming their commercial model, trying to unify sales, marketing, and customer success, and the operations. They include, and we'll meet them as we go, Jeff McKittrick, who is Vice President of Sales Execution at WalkMe, which recently went public, thanks to Jeff, and a Managing Director of Digital Sales Strategies at our Institute. Greg leads Global Sales Operations at Canonical, and he is a Managing Director of Sales Transformation at the Institute. Chris Hummel is a 3-time CMO and the Managing Director of CXO Programs at the Institute. We want to talk about the trends that are making RevOps a CEO and board level issue. So the growing complexity of technology-enabled selling, amplified by business model transformation to the cloud, and changing customer behavior has changed the basis for generating revenue growth. These 6 mega trends have changed the formula for growing revenues over the past several decades so much that they have effectively rendered traditional structures for managing the people, processes, and technologies that support revenue growth obsolete. So my question to the group is, what do you see as the biggest forces behind the drive to unify sales, marketing, and service, and the operations that support them in your businesses, being on the front lines? Does anyone want to lead?
Yeah, Stephen, I'll jump in just a little bit. So part of this research has come from obviously a number of conversations and interviews that we've done with CXOs. And one of the most topical ones, but it's also something that is connected in the long term, so to speak, a big arc, is really around the use of digital technologies in selling, particularly virtual selling. So given that with the pandemic has had us over the last year and a half, that's obviously become front and center in terms of urgent for everybody. Contactless selling, delivery methodologies, selling from a remote base, but also in trying to incorporate virtual technology into the selling process, not necessarily replacing them, but finding that balance in the hybrid selling model between using the capabilities of great sellers and great selling processes and structures, and also with the new digital technologies that allow for a much more enriched conversation.
Jeff, Greg, any thoughts on how these trends have impacted your business?
Pick up a little bit on where Chris said. One, of course, virtual selling is ubiquitous now, right? And there's a lot of tech being deployed there. And part of it is you've got to get that tech in a way that, one, drives the behavior you want, but two, you've got to get salespeople to use it. So you're changing and adding a lot of tech in front of them. You've got to give them a way to adopt it. You've got to make it simple. You've got to automate, et cetera. And you've got to fuel with it. You've got to be thinking about the customer's journey that goes along with that. And it's not just from the sales process, but then it's all the way into the post-sale journey as well. So I'll go on kind of a top right here, this advanced analytics and kind of this accountability of starting to look at how do you get the data in front of your sales teams and all the teams that kind of align them really well, right? A key thing of revenue operations is how do you make sure you've got agreed upon data and something that says not only do you win the customer, but how do you make sure the customer is successful with what they bought and how do you expand the customer? That's a big part of the growth motion. And it requires these things to be integrated together because you can't be disconnected in that motion or the customer gets a bad experience, they're subject to churn or turning away from your offer.
Yeah, I might add to that. I think building on Jeff's point about the ecosystem, the technology, I think we're living through sort of an interesting phase right now where we have a lot of disparate systems. It's complicated for the customer, it's complicated for internals, and it's exacerbated by a lot of these other factors. And interestingly, several of the companies I've talked to most recently, they actually talk about having too many tools and being overwhelmed by that experience. So I think part of the trend is absolutely going to a simplification in terms of really understanding what your core requirements are, what are you trying to do, and build out systems to be able to provide that capability.
Our next question deals with the business case. Our research shows that organizations that move to a RevOps model that aligns revenue teams and operations, optimizes the commercial architecture to reflect the new economics of selling, can contribute 5 to 10 points to bottom line profit contribution by rationalizing resources and making better use of them. Or if reinvested, some of the studies we've done have shown that they improve long-term growth prospects substantively. So my question for you guys is, in your personal experiences, what are the biggest reasons why the CEO needs to care about RevOps?
Stephen, let me pick up on some of the research you were talking about and some of the rationale for this. Today, the only executive who really has responsibility for building a growth strategy and integrating the levers to drive revenue in most companies is the CEO. And so what happens for those companies is this creates a lot of bottlenecks. The authority of functional leaders, sales, marketing, service, whatever they may be, are often too segregated and siloed to capture the full opportunity for growth. It also means that the sheer volume of decisions, both strategic and tactical, that a CEO ends up getting dragged into can sometimes overwhelm the organization and either never get addressed or get addressed in such a manner that doesn't really solve the ultimate problem. And I think one of the fundamental elements of this is that collaboration around revenue has historically been an informal art without a structure. And so now, as you mentioned earlier, the new job roles that are emerging, the new responsibilities, the difference between a CRO or a CMO or whatever the role is at different companies is almost as unique as a fingerprint. And so that kind of ambiguity on where growth and revenue are really being driven from are either overwhelming the CEO or creating all kinds of bottlenecks down in the company. And that's one of the big reasons that people are now starting to look at, how do I bring this all together?
Yeah, I think those models as well and the roles that are coming in, this motivating team selling, which looks to be, to me, the largest one in here, if we look at the size of the word cloud, right? It's definitely something we're going through and what I'm seeing as well as going on in our customers that we're talking about. It is integrating and saying that how do I get all of these functions lined up all the way from the start of trying to prospect and get deeper into our existing customers with BDRs, those selling teams, and then how do I coordinate that again with how do I position services, my customer success motion further up in that, and putting some of that even in new compensation models. So revenue ops is responsible to look at the compensation models. What's the right mix of sales teams? What do we need to change some go to market? And how do we even build out new territories? What do you need for the ratios of all of that is critical, kind of to seeing that you get the growth right, you get the right investments in that, and then you see that you get the right returns on it.
Greg?
Yeah, and while there are so many powerful capabilities out there, none of it matters if people don't use it. And a lot of conversations I've had have been around change management and adoption. And I'll pick up on my earlier point. It's important to have a strategy to know what you're trying to solve for. And then it's important to execute the strategy in terms of how are you deploying capabilities so that it's a natural sort of alignment to their workflow and not some weird other place they have to go that's not a natural movement. And I think that's an area of focus, is really understanding what you're solving and how to drive adoption to make sure that the capability is actually effective. Remarkably, there is still a lot of shelfware, a lot of licenses and users that are just sitting there.
So our next question deals with the blueprint. I mentioned earlier, our faculty went to town and created a 115-page blueprint. We can get into that. You can get access to that. We built a maturity model that helps CEOs and growth leaders to execute RevOps, get their teams working together. The model looks at 6 elements, from commercial leadership to operations and what we call architecture, coverage, and Salesforce design, to what Jeff talked about, commercial insight, Greg's issue of enablement, and the notion of asset management, the customer data, tech, and content within your organization. So later on in this presentation, we'll give you access to this blueprint. You can get this, we explain it. But at a high level, in your current and past businesses, which of these 6 elements have proven critical to the transformation of your commercial model?
So we may want to start, Stephen, by building off the research here, which obviously shows that the financial impact of growth is enormous. And so whichever way you can do the models that drive growth, that's great. The real shift here is in that competition is now being focused around the experience, the customer experience, that's the primary battleground now for differentiation. And so any gaps in that buying or even the consumption experience, which I think Jeff was talking about, create moments, negative moments that could potentially lose you business. And so strategy, technology, tactics all have to come together for that customer experience to really create the conditions for scalable growth. And technology is a key part of that, but it's just that shifting nature of where the battle really takes place is one of the big model shifts.
So Chris, in our parlance, that would fall under commercial operations, creating one throat to choke, if you would, to own the entire cross-functional commercial process, fill in those gaps and pain points. We're seeing a lot of organizations start with consolidating the operations so that one person is responsible for that experience, that process, and all the systems underlying that. That would be your vote, I guess. Jeff, I know you've got some strong opinions related to leadership in other areas.
Yeah, well, one is definitely, if you just look at this line of the top-down leadership, right? There has to be leadership aligned this, and it has to be, consistency and accountability about using the tools, using the data, the planning that goes on around that, and then measuring how it goes. I'm going to come back to these insights though, as you look at kind of the right-hand side and all of the things around there, KPIs and the predictive selling insights. We're seeing just even in our own business, right? Needing to be able to go at scale means needing to be able to say that I've got the right insights and the stuff that I can put in front of my sellers. And that could be a customer success person or a salesperson that says items like a health score, right? Now that I've sold the deal or I'm coming upon a renewal, how do I know that the customer is healthy? And how do I even automate some actions that help that customer be successful? How do I help customers self-serve so that I can scale with the folks, right? What used to be very high touch, to your point of the nature of customer expectations changing, they want to be able to self-serve. They want to know how to make themselves successful. You've got to put in the insights and the tools that help them get there. So I think that's a valuable part of the research here.
Greg, do you have a starting point or an element of this maturity model that really is a lever in your business?
I think I would build on Chris's point around strategy to execution, right? So when I think about maturity model, it is, think about the aspects of terms of strategy, strategic aspects. So we highlight a couple here, which I would include architecture as well. So having that blueprint plan of it through then enablement and asset management. I think the points that Jeff were making around leadership and such are super important. But then when you're getting into the doing, you really have to think about strategy to execution.
Our next question is about the role of revenue operations in specific businesses. So revenue growth drives firm value in every business. The relationship between growth and value is getting tighter and tighter. You all come from different business models, having led enablement and sales operations at Cisco, Lenovo, United Rentals, Schneider Electric, Red Hat. And now Jeff and Greg are working in hypergrowth businesses, WalkMe and Canonical. Given your unique business model, because everyone is different, how is RevOps impacting the value of your business, Jeff and Greg, particularly that you're in hypergrowth businesses? And congratulations, Jeff, having just gone public.
Yeah, and it's certainly a different world, and it's the pace and what you work on is certainly pretty exciting. So what I would say, having been part of some of the traditional enterprise groups and how it was about optimization, scale, and some of that. At these points, it's about how do you get to those next opportunities and drive that growth. So it's much more, how do you get the right resource? How do you recruit for that resource? And how do you start to set up? And a little bit of experimentation. We have to get the data and say, hey, as we're going into these markets, what's working well, and then what can we replicate for that? So it's definitely about RevOps has to produce the data. They have to provide the models for us to go forward and really kind of get us to say, we have these models where we need to get to this growth rate. It's just an expectation. How fast do we need to hire? How fast do we need to ramp? I own the enablement function for a hypergrowth company. It's how many people can I get through and how successful can I get them time to their first deal? How do I make sure their next deal follows? How do I make sure the deals are growing? How do I make sure they successfully are positioned against our growing market of competition? How do we take advantage of new opportunities? So it's absolutely a way that you have to have a RevOps team that supports you in this way and gives you the data and the fuel to go for that kind of scale and opportunity.
And you've been rewarded with a high valuation, but it takes a lot of growth and retention to achieve escape velocity, and be in that upper right-hand corner. Greg, you're on a trajectory to get there. And you look at this and talk a lot about the rule of 40 and some of the principles you're trying to instill in your organization to move up to that upper right-hand corner.
Yeah, and I would say relatively not as frenetic, right? Because we're more in a mode of setting ourselves up for success down the road. So some of our priorities are a bit different. I would say at Canonical, we're maniacally focused on hiring the right people, and we have a very rigorous process around both designing the organization and then filling the organization with the right talent into the team, and responsible growth, right? We're making sure that we're getting the right business. It's really about building the right partnerships, whether those partnerships are with our customers or with our alliances. So I would say it's more of a mindset around building the strong foundation within the organization.
Chris, you've worked at SAP, Oracle, half the Fortune 500, it seems, as a leader. RevOps is relevant to every business, large and small. The growth rates may be different. The levers may be different. But can you talk a little bit about the impact of RevOps on a larger enterprise?
Well, again, so the points that Greg and Jeff were making, growth is king here. And what's kind of interesting, having seen it evolve in a number of different industries, tech, industry, energy, is that historically, I think smaller companies were looking up at the larger companies and saying, how do I do what they do? How do I reach scale? And now what's happening a little bit is the enterprises are turning and looking down, if I want to say just in terms of size, or looking up at the high growth companies and saying, how do I get what they have? Now, at a large enterprise, you can't handle growth at 40, 50% a year. It will rip you apart. So your aspirations are a little bit smaller. But if you note from the chart you have here, right, the impact of getting even a few percentage points of extra growth just create an enormous amount of value. And so if you can get into double-digit growth, that's where you start to see real separation in terms of how a company gets valued. And what it's essentially saying is you can't afford to leave anything on the table, right? It's not enough to just manage growth and kind of find a right spot. Okay, yes, you can get some value just solving your margin maximization in a complex enterprise. But if you can start to layer pieces on, there's always another level to get to. And I think that's where we've talked about leadership and courage. We've talked about all the operational pieces. But I think the most important element here is it doesn't mean that you have to throw away your entire business if you're an enterprise. What it means is start to build the 9 pieces of a revenue operating system. Start to tackle them one by one and then thread them together. Because ultimately, whether you do it organizationally or you do it through some sort of process or you do it in some other way, putting all of your wood behind an arrow, meaning your sales, your marketing, your service, your product, behind that arrow of growth, that's how you're going to achieve exponential or radical performance improvement. It's not going to be done by turning individual dials and just getting operational improvements out of one or the other area. They have to all be force multipliers working together. And that's really, if you think about it, that's what a revenue operating system is.
The next question is about the importance of top-down leadership for RevOps to succeed. I know that there's this notion of a CXO out there. Chris leads that practice. But Jeff, you've just gone public. You are on a tremendous growth trajectory. Does the world need a super empowered CXO that owns all these things? And how important that is in your business?
Absolutely. I work directly for the chief revenue officer, which is a role that's been in place, right? But it's really strongly responsible to line up all of these resources. In fact, until just recently, we had customer success, the BDR organization, and all that in one place. We've just actually announced that a chief customer officer is being invested in, right? As really taking a look at that entire post-sale customer journey and really lining that up. It's becoming so critical to us, particularly in a software space, that you want to make sure your customers are getting value. You want to make sure that they're getting supported properly. You want to make sure that they're willing to not only renew, but that they can expand. And so we have put a major focus on that. We're really excited to have a new leader starting there that partners together well with the revenue officer and really takes that whole customer journey end to end and makes sure that we, one, aren't losing anybody, but two, that we're continuing to expand and grow in our existing customer base while we're also attracting new logos.
Wow. Chris, I know you lead our CXO practice and you're at the forefront of working with human resources, headhunting, and businesses to redefine what growth leadership looks like. What are your thoughts here?
Well, I think the interesting thing is I would take everything that Jeff said and I would wipe off just for software companies and I would put for companies, right? That essentially the idea of how you drive a buying process and how you drive a consumption process, the usage afterwards, and the cycle that you constantly go through, that applies to businesses, whether they're kind of, let's call them old school knuckle dragger or whether they're high tech and on the bleeding edge. So what you're now seeing is HR professionals, CEOs who are trying to build their leadership team. There's a lot of frustration in terms of the ask and the get. meaning how they define the roles. So Jeff talked about a new chief customer officer. Chief customer officer in one place can be something completely different than in another place. And so what they're looking for is they're looking for people who are able to adapt. And I call it the fill in the grout people, right? People who can actually weave in between all the blocks that are there, regardless of what their actual official position on the field is, that they can cover for other places, that they cross boundaries is very important. And they do that both informally, and it's up to the company to establish formal means of crossing boundaries, right? That collaboration is no longer an art. It has to be an art and a science. And then I often used for my teams, and I've managed teams from 6 to 6,000. I've often said ambiguity has to be your best friend. You have to recognize that ambiguity is going to be there and just accept it. And that's to some degree the leadership that has to come through to manage in an imperfect world, or in a world with lack of complete data. Analytics are great, but you're still never going to have complete data. So this is where leadership and culture layer on top of technology and infrastructure, talent and process. When we talk about bureaucracy, it's not in terms of slowing down, it's just in terms of connecting processes between people. And so finding the talent who can deal with the change and the ambiguity and all the shifts that need to be made as a business develops, those are some of the hardest challenges that are out there, because the technology is available. The business models, as we've talked about, there's a new 21st century commercial model that's emerging. Having the talent in place and the leadership in particular to manage it is probably, I would argue, based on what we've seen, challenge number one.
There's a lot to unpack there, and a small advertisement for your efforts. Chris leads the CXO 100 program, and you can double click down and hear CEOs, CMOs, CROs, and combinations talking about their live experiences on the CXO 100 website. We'll get back to. But building on something that Greg said, strategy is great, execution is everything. The last thing I want to discuss is how do we stair step our way to commercial transformation. The RevOps report is 115 pages. Our maturity model is very specific with evidence of 72 points of maturity. So we have an amazingly comprehensive blueprint for running RevOps in a 21st century commercial model. It's clear every organization needs to align sales, marketing, and success to drive scalable and sustainable. But I want to talk a little bit about whether the change management burden and the leadership burden is a bridge too far, and how an organization can take steps to move in this direction. Greg or Chris, do you have experience to share here?
Yeah, the best way to manage through the complexities of change management is to simplify what you're trying to accomplish. And one of the tools and the capabilities I'm most excited about is around the commercial technology audit, right? I think it's essential for any company. It doesn't matter how big or small, how many tools or not you have, to just understand and appreciate what you have. And what I'm finding, again, is interesting, is that it's all over the place. Some companies have barely tools at all. Others have every tool around and every point in between. So I think it's important to complete that audit just to have an appreciation of what you have there. And the other capability I would talk about is around follow the money workflow. Just appreciate how things get done and where does it go, and just have that experience. And when I was at Red Hat, one of the things that we did, which was just astounding, was we filled a conference room with a bunch of sheets of butcher paper and Post-it notes. And for a week, we basically built the opportunity to order sales process out. And we brought our CFO through, we brought our CEO through, because you can't fix what you don't understand. So you have to build an understanding of your process and then take it from there.
I couldn't agree more. And having talked to over 100 senior executives, defining, owning, and compressing and optimizing that prospect to cash cycle is critical. And I think from a leadership perspective, having one throat to choke or an individual who owns that is a great place to start. I know Chris has a strong opinion. Chris, what's your view on how people can start to peel this onion?
Yeah, so I'll start at one end, at the opposite end of Greg, and then come back to where Greg's at, because I think he's absolutely right. But from my experience, and almost every job I've had has been around some sort of inflection point or transformation point, whether it's digital or new customer approach or growth or stopping whatever in the 5 or so companies I've worked with. And you have to have both elements to overcome the inertia and the challenge of change. And the first one is you've got to have a vision. You've got to have an end game that you're trying to get to, some goal. It doesn't have to be 100% architected out, but at least it needs to be named. What is the definition of success? It can be as simple as that. And Stephen, as you and I talk about all the time after these conversations with the CXOs we talk to, so often when we ask them what's the definition of success, they kind of pause and they're not really sure. They go, well, revenue growth. Okay, well, where and how much? And they kind of freeze a little bit because they're so mired in the day to day. So it's important to pull your head up a little bit and define what success is going to be, put a vision around it, whether it's got lots of pixie dust or no pixie dust whatsoever. But the other part that Greg was talking about is really important, is find the tangible wins that you can do right. How do you connect sales and marketing? And it doesn't need to be, how do you connect the sales department with the marketing department? It can be something simple. I remember at Oracle, we pioneered something called the Demand Generation Board, which sounds really bureaucratic, but essentially it was a quarterly meeting between the sales and marketing leadership to just define what the opportunities we were going to go after and which ones we wouldn't. And amazingly, in that conversation, tactical issues would come up, strategic issues would come up, but at least we had a forum where we would go and talk about that. And you can talk about your website, you can talk about your sales enablement, the content that has to cross between sales, marketing, and service instead of operating as silos. Pick 2 or 3 of those starting points. And again, use our research if you like as a guide in what we call the 21st century commercial model. But whatever it is, find the starting points that deliver some tangible value. And then what you'll find is step by step, just like Greg was talking about, technology audit or whatever it is, you'll start to build momentum towards that definition of success. And all of a sudden, the inertia will be carrying you forward rather than slowing you down.
Well, I think that's great. And again, we're peeling back this onion. And so our point of view collectively is put somebody in charge to look at this problem. There's money in these hills. The second, I'd encourage everyone to read the report or abstracts of the report at the Revenue Enablement website. We recommend you conduct a revenue operations maturity assessment. As big as it is, within an hour, we can give you a pretty quick picture of where the tangible wins and starting points are in your business and help you string them together, because execution is about stringing together wins and building muscle and value at every step. One thing that is doable for most any organization is to pilot connecting the dots on this data in terms of real-time guidance and coaching. We could show you how to do that. We recommend people audit their commercial architecture to size the opportunity to improve by modulating coverage, engagement, roles, segmentation, and targeting. Most organizations can see 50% improvements by getting that right. And to Greg's points, we recommend doing a commercial technology portfolio review. I'll review these all briefly. You can get access to the Revenue Operations in the 21st Century Commercial Model report at our website or arrange a briefing with one of our faculty. For executives who want to learn faster, our faculty has incorporated the business practices underlying the 6 elements of the revenue operations model into a detailed but intuitive 72-point operations benchmark. We've created an easy-to-use tool that's designed to help business owners, CEOs, and growth leaders to identify the big gaps in their commercial approach and stair-step their way towards operational alignment and commercial excellence by identifying the big gaps and weaknesses in their commercial model, agreeing on the most impactful ways to better align sales, marketing, and customer success teams, and laying out concrete steps to optimize the performance of their commercial models. So this takes less than an hour and is quite robust. The next thing is our faculty can help your operations team to test and prove the impact of data-driven selling by piloting real-time coaching and guidance. Jeff talked about this a lot. Every organization has the engaged seller activity, recorded calls, CRM data to pilot real-time guidance and coaching at scale. If leadership asked, we can show you how that can be a reality in 60 days. In terms of a business case, size the financial impact of optimizing your commercial model in terms of adjusting account priorities, coverage model, engagement model, selling roles, territory assignments. When you add them up, this can lead to significant selling improvement, and we can help you do that. And then finally, what Greg and Jeff talked about is this notion of a technology stack audit, looking at how your technology portfolio is supporting the day-to-day workflow and where the hotspots are in the process. Greg has done a great webinar with us that talks about how consolidating these panes of glass and eliminating these hotspots create huge value in terms of seller effectiveness and satisfaction. Jeff won an award for knitting these together. There's dollars in these hills. These are very productive steps. Thank you so much for your time. You can learn more at revenueenablement.com.